Nathan stood in the middle of Grandma's living room, holding a stack of papers like he had just won something none of us even knew we were playing for. Afternoon sunlight stretched across the hardwood floor, catching the dust in the air. The room was full of relatives, but no one spoke. Not even Grandma. Everyone stared at those papers in Nathan's hand, then slowly at me, like they were waiting to see how I would react. "Grandma signed it yesterday," Nathan said calmly, almost proudly. "This house legally belongs to me now." For a moment, I thought I had heard him wrong. My ears rang, and the words seemed to hang in the air longer than they should have. Grandma sat quietly in her chair near the window, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes uncertain. She didn't look proud. She didn't look relieved. She looked confused. Before I could even ask what he meant, the doorbell rang. Nathan didn't hesitate. He walked straight to the door and opened it like he had been expecting someone. Two men stepped inside carrying toolboxes. A locksmith. The man avoided looking at me as he walked past, heading straight toward the front door. Metal tools clinked softly as he knelt down. I heard the first sharp click of metal turning inside the lock. "What are you doing?" I asked, my voice tighter than I intended. Nathan didn't look at me. "Making sure everything is secure," he replied. Secure. That word hit harder than anything else he had said. The locksmith removed the old lock piece by piece, setting it carefully into a small tray. Each metallic sound echoed louder than it should have in that silent room. My chest tightened with every turn of his screwdriver. I took a step forward. "Nathan, what is this?" He finally looked at me, and there was something in his expression I hadn't seen before. Not anger. Not frustration. Confidence. "You can still visit Claire," he said, his tone steady. "But this is no longer your home." The room stayed silent, but I could feel the shift. People avoided my eyes. A cousin leaned toward another and whispered something I couldn't hear. Someone near the doorway cleared their throat like they were uncomfortable witnessing what was happening but unwilling to stop it. I stood there, frozen, listening to the final click of the new lock snapping into place. That sound felt final, like a door closing on years of my life. After the locksmith finished, he handed Nathan a small envelope containing new keys. Nathan took them without hesitation. Then he pulled one out and extended it toward me. "Here," he said. I stared at the key in his hand. Not the master key, just a spare. I took it slowly, the cold metal pressing into my palm. It felt lighter than the one I had carried for years, like it didn't carry the same authority anymore. "Behind me," someone muttered. "I thought Claire lived here." I swallowed hard. So did I. Nathan moved through the house with a clipboard in his hand, stopping at corners and glancing at walls like he was already planning changes. I noticed something missing as he walked past the hallway. My picture. A framed photograph that had hung there for years, one of me standing beside Grandma at her birthday dinner, was gone. In its place was a faint square outline on the wall, where the paint had been protected from sunlight. A blank space, like I had been erased. That was when I first noticed her. She stood near the dining table, dressed sharply in a navy blazer, holding a tablet in her hands. Her posture was perfect, her smile controlled. Professional. I didn't recognize her. And yet she moved through the house like she belonged there. She leaned toward Nathan and spoke quietly. Their voices dropped to whispers the moment I stepped closer. When she noticed me watching, she straightened and offered a polite smile, but she didn't introduce herself. Didn't say her name. Didn't explain why she was standing in my grandmother's house reviewing documents like an accountant reviewing inventory. Something about her calm expression made my skin prickle. I turned away from them and walked toward Grandma's bedroom. The familiar scent of lavender lotion greeted me as I stepped inside. Soft light filtered through the curtains, casting gentle shadows across her bed. Medical supplies rested neatly on the side table, pill bottles, water glass, folded notes. Grandma looked up at me. Her eyes were tired. "Claire," she said softly, "why are there strangers in my house?" My throat tightened. "I'm not sure yet," I replied carefully, forcing my voice to stay steady. She glanced toward the doorway and lowered her voice. Did Nathan tell you what I signed? That question landed heavier than anything else that day. You signed papers yesterday, I asked. She nodded slowly. He said it would help him take care of things, she murmured. Just temporary. Temporary. That word echoed inside my head. Before I could ask more, Nathan appeared in the hallway behind me. Claire, he said sharply. You don't need to go into the office anymore. I turned toward him. The office door stood behind him, closed. And now, for the first time in years, locked. A brand new lock gleamed under the hallway light. What are you hiding? I asked quietly. He didn't answer. Instead, he stepped sideways, blocking the doorway completely, his body forming a wall between me and that room. That was when I noticed movement outside the window. Mrs. Holloway, our next-door neighbor, stood near her mailbox, pretending to sort letters. But her eyes weren't on the envelopes. They were on me. Her expression looked uneasy, concerned. Even when Nathan turned away, she raised her hand slightly and mouthed two silent words. Call me later. I didn't respond. But the message settled into my chest like a warning. One by one, the relatives began leaving the house. No one offered support. No one spoke up. A distant cousin brushed past me near the door and whispered, It's his now. Nothing you can do. Nothing you can do. The words stung more than Nathan's declaration. By the time the last guest left, the house felt colder, quieter, foreign. Nathan walked toward the front door and opened it. You can come during the day, he said casually. Just don't forget, this isn't your home anymore. I stepped outside slowly, my heart pounding against my ribs. Behind me, the door shut. Click. That sound echoed through the porch like an ending. As I walked down the driveway, my eyes drifted back toward Grandma's bedroom window. That was when I saw it. A sealed envelope resting on her bedside table, facing outward. My name written clearly across the front. Claire Bennett. I didn't know yet that whatever Grandma had signed would change everything. The next morning felt colder than it should have, even though the sun was already rising over the rooftops. I stood on the sidewalk across from the house, holding a paper cup of coffee that had gone lukewarm in my hand. The house looked exactly the same as it always had. White siding, blue shutters, flower boxes under the windows. But something inside it had shifted overnight. I walked slowly up the front steps, the wooden boards creaking beneath my shoes. For years, I had walked through that front door without thinking. I had carried groceries through it. Medicine, laundry baskets, birthday cakes. It had never occurred to me that one day I would have to knock. I slipped the key Nathan had given me into the lock. It didn't turn. My hand froze around the handle. I tried again, slower this time, pushing slightly as I twisted. Nothing. A new lock. A lock that didn't recognize me. I stood there for a few seconds, staring at the handle like it might suddenly change its mind. Finally, I knocked. The sound echoed louder than it should have against the quiet morning air. Footsteps approached from inside. Nathan opened the door halfway and leaned against the frame like he had all the time in the world. You're early, he said flatly. I'm here to see Grandma, I replied. He didn't move aside right away. Instead, he looked at me, studying my face like he was measuring how much of me still belonged there. After a long pause, he stepped aside just enough to let me pass. But he didn't say welcome. Inside, the house felt different. Not messy. Not chaotic. Just rearranged in ways that didn't make sense. A stack of papers sat on the dining table. The air smelled faintly like cleaning chemicals. Sharp and unfamiliar. Nathan followed me into the living room. From now on, he said casually, there are some rules. I stopped walking. What rules? You can visit Grandma, he continued, glancing down at his clipboard. But stay downstairs unless I say otherwise. Stay downstairs. Like I was a guest. Like I didn't know every creak of the upstairs floor. Every loose tile in the hallway bathroom. Every shadow that passed across Grandma's bedroom window at sunset. I swallowed my anger. And the office? I asked. You don't need to go in there anymore. Of course. That office had been where Grandma kept every document, medical records, property papers, old letters tied with ribbon. For years, I had organized those files, making sure nothing was misplaced. Now the door remained closed, locked. Nathan walked toward the hallway while I stood still, noticing something else missing. The photograph. For years, a framed picture had hung along the hallway wall, a photo of me and Grandma smiling at her 85th birthday dinner. It had been taken in this very house, standing beside the piano that now sat somewhere far away from us. Now there was only a pale rectangle where sunlight hadn't touched the paint. I stared at it longer than I should have. Someone had taken it down. Someone had decided I didn't belong on that wall anymore. You shouldn't take it personally, Nathan said behind me, noticing my stare. We're reorganizing. Reorganizing. That word felt too clean for what was happening. Before I could respond, I heard the sound of heels tapping softly across the hardwood floor. I turned. She stood near the dining table again, the woman from yesterday. Her posture was straight, her expression composed, her tablet balanced neatly in one hand. Good morning, she said with a practiced smile. You must be Claire. Her voice was smooth, rehearsed. And you are? I asked. Melissa Carter, she replied. Financial advisor. Advisor. Not family. Not caregiver. Not friend. She stepped closer to the table and tapped lightly on her tablet. I'm helping Nathan organize the estate, she added. Estate. That word hit harder than I expected. Estate was what people talked about after someone passed away, not while they were still alive. Still breathing in the room just down the hallway. Grandma was alive. She was still here. Estate, I repeated slowly. Melissa nodded as if it were the most natural thing in the world. It's standard procedure, she said calmly. Standard. Another clean word hiding something messy underneath. I didn't answer. Instead, I walked past them toward Grandma's bedroom. The door was slightly open. Grandma sat in her usual chair near the window, wrapped in a soft blanket. Morning light fell across her shoulders, making her look smaller somehow. Claire, she said softly when she saw me. Relief flooded her face, like she had been waiting. I'm here, I said gently. She reached for my hand, her fingers colder than usual. Why did Nathan move my things? She asked quietly. I frowned. What things? She pointed toward the dresser. I followed her gaze. The jewelry box was gone. Not moved. Gone. My chest tightened. Grandma's wedding ring had always stayed inside that box. Even after my grandfather passed, she never let it leave her sight for long. Did he say where it went? She asked. No, I said carefully. But I'll find out. Her grip tightened around my fingers. I didn't think they'd take things, she whispered. Take. Not move. Not reorganize. Take. Later that afternoon, I stepped back into the living room and saw Melissa and Nathan leaning over stacks of documents spread across the dining table. Papers were clipped together, labeled with colored tabs, arranged in neat rows. We'll need to restructure her accounts, Melissa said quietly. Restructure. Another clean word. What accounts? I asked. Melissa glanced up briefly, her smile returning like it had never left. It's standard procedure, she repeated. Nathan didn't even look at me. Everything's under control, he added. Control. That word sounded louder than it should have. Before I could respond, the front door opened again. 2 men stepped inside carrying moving blankets. My stomach dropped. What's going on now? I demanded. Nathan barely glanced in my direction. We're reorganizing storage, he said. The movers walked straight toward the hallway, wrapping furniture carefully, lifting objects like they had done this many times before. Grandma watched from her doorway, her eyes following every movement. Fear settled into her face. Real fear. Not confusion. Not uncertainty. Fear. Later. I stepped outside for air. my chest tight with tension. The afternoon breeze felt cooler than it should have. Mrs. Holloway stood near the fence separating our yards. She walked toward me slowly, her expression tight. "I saw a truck here last night," she whispered. My heart skipped. "What kind of truck?" "Large one," she replied quietly. "No company name." "They were loading boxes before sunrise." "Before sunrise." "Without telling anyone." I nodded slowly, trying to steady my breathing. "Thank you," I whispered. When I returned inside, the kitchen felt colder than before. I sat down at the table, staring at the empty space where familiar items used to rest. That was when I noticed the drawer, slightly open. I reached inside and pulled out a stack of papers. Emergency contact forms. I scanned the list quickly. Doctor, pharmacy, neighbor, Nathan. But my name was gone. Removed. Erased. My chest tightened again. But this time it wasn't shock. It was something heavier. Something harder. As I stood there holding the paper, voices drifted from the hallway. Low. Careful. Melissa and Nathan. I stepped quietly toward the corner, staying just out of sight. Melissa's voice dropped to a whisper. She still doesn't know about the second file. My breath caught. Nathan answered softly. Good, he said. Let's keep it that way. Second file. The words echoed in my head long after their footsteps faded. Later that evening, I returned to Grandma's room to check on her. She had fallen asleep, her breathing slow and steady. I adjusted her blanket gently and turned to leave. That was when I noticed something on her bedside table. A folded document, half hidden beneath a book. Only a few words visible. Trust amendment. I stared at it, my heart pounding harder with each second. That was the first moment I realized. Whatever Grandma had signed wasn't just about the house. The next morning, the house felt too quiet. Sunlight crept across the living room floor, touching the wide empty space where the piano used to stand. The outline it left behind was sharp and pale, like a memory burned into wood. I stood there longer than I meant to, staring at the dust marks that traced its old shape. Grandma shuffled slowly into the room behind me, her slippers whispering against the floor. Claire, she said softly, her voice unsure. Where did the chair go? I turned. She was pointing to the corner near the window. The old wooden chair that had belonged to her father was gone too. It had always sat there, beside the lace curtain, where sunlight warmed the seat every afternoon. I had polished that chair myself every few months, careful not to scratch the worn arms where generations of hands had rested. I don't know yet, I answered gently, her brows pulled together. I didn't say they could take it, she whispered. The way she said take made my chest tighten. Not move. Not store. Take. I walked toward her slowly, guiding her back into her chair near the window. Her fingers brushed the empty air where the chair once stood, searching for something familiar that was no longer there. I don't remember signing that much paperwork, she murmured. I froze. What do you mean? I asked quietly. She stared at the floor, her voice barely above a whisper. I thought it was just to help Nathan pay bills, she said. Just temporary. Temporary. That word had followed me since yesterday, echoing in places where certainty used to live. After settling her with her morning medications, I walked toward the kitchen to prepare tea. The drawers sat slightly open, like someone had searched through them carelessly. As I reached into the lower cabinet for a fresh box of tea bags, something slipped loose from the stack of medical supplies. A folded piece of paper. It drifted to the floor near my foot. I bent down and picked it up slowly. The paper felt thin, worn along the edges. It wasn't placed neatly like something important. It looked hidden, tucked away where no one would expect to find it. I unfolded it carefully. Legal language stretched across the page in tight paragraphs. At the bottom sat a signature. Grandma's name. But something about it felt wrong. I stared at the letters longer than I should have. The shape didn't match the careful loops she had always used. The lines looked rushed, uneven, like they had been written in haste or confusion. A cold wave crept through my chest. I walked to the drawer near the refrigerator and pulled out an old birthday card Grandma had signed months earlier. I placed it beside the paper, lining the signatures side by side. The difference was subtle, but undeniable. Her usual handwriting curved smoothly. The letters flowed into one another with practiced care. This signature hesitated. It looked uncertain, like someone rushing to finish something they didn't fully understand. I swallowed hard. Had she really signed this willingly? Or had someone pushed her to hurry? As I stared at the two signatures, a memory surfaced from years ago. Grandma sat at this very table, wearing her reading glasses low on her nose, holding a contract between her fingers. Never sign anything without reading every line twice. She had told me, tapping the paper with her pen. People count on you rushing. She had been careful, meticulous, protective of every detail. The woman who gave that advice would never sign blindly, not unless she trusted someone. Too much. The sound of the telephone ringing shattered my thoughts. I flinched before grabbing the receiver. "Hello." A polite voice answered. "May I speak with Mrs. Eleanor Bennett regarding her new account?" My stomach dropped. "New account?" I repeated. There was a pause on the other end. "Yes, ma'am," the caller said cautiously. "We opened it last week." "Last week?" No one had mentioned any new account. She can't handle financial calls alone, I replied carefully. "Can you tell me what account this is about?" Another pause. Longer this time. "I may need authorization," the caller said nervously. His hesitation said more than his words. "Thank you," I murmured, hanging up slowly. A new account. Opened without my knowledge. Without explanation. My pulse quickened. Before I could process the thought, footsteps echoed down the hallway. Melissa entered the kitchen, her tablet tucked neatly under her arm. Nathan followed close behind her, his expression tight. She glanced toward me briefly before turning toward the office door. He unlocked it. They stepped inside together. The door closed. Locked again. I stood there, staring at the polished brass handle, my mind racing. That room had become the center of something hidden, something they didn't want me to see. Minutes passed. Too many minutes. Their voices stayed low, muffled behind the wood. Whatever lived inside that room mattered, more than anything else. Later that afternoon, I walked slowly through the hallway, dusting shelves that no longer held their usual decorations. That was when I noticed the binder. It sat slightly crooked against the wall, where I knew it hadn't been before. The label caught my attention immediately. Estate Review. My fingers hovered above it for a moment before I pulled it down carefully. The binder felt heavier than expected. Inside, neatly organized pages filled the first section. Property lists, financial notes, inventory records. But several plastic sleeves near the back were empty. Blank. Missing pages. My chest tightened. Someone had removed them deliberately. Not misplaced. Removed. That meant something important had been taken out. Something they didn't want recorded. As evening settled over the house, I returned to Grandma's room. She sat quietly in her chair, her hands folded in her lap. "Nathan said it was temporary," she whispered without looking up. Her voice sounded tired. "He said it would protect the house." Protect. That word felt twisted now. "You trusted him," I said softly. She nodded. "I didn't think he would take things," she murmured. I sat beside her, holding her hand as silence filled the room. Later that night, after she fell asleep, I returned to the folded paper I had found earlier. I sat at the kitchen table beneath the dim overhead light, reading every line carefully. That was when I saw it. Near the bottom of the page, a paragraph I hadn't noticed before. The words were smaller than the rest, buried between legal phrases, conditional management rights. I leaned closer, my heart pounding. Conditional, not permanent, not ownership. My breath caught in my throat. For the first time since Nathan declared the house his, a flicker of hope stirred somewhere deep inside my chest. That was the moment I realized Nathan might not own the house the way he claimed. That night, I sat alone at the kitchen table long after everyone else had gone quiet. The overhead light cast a dull yellow circle across the papers spread in front of me. Outside, the neighborhood had settled into silence, broken only by the occasional sound of a car passing down the street. Inside the house, every small noise felt louder than it should have: the ticking clock on the wall, the faint hum of the refrigerator, the soft creak of floorboards cooling after a long day. I leaned closer to the page again. That same line caught my eye. Conditional Management Authority. I traced the words slowly with my finger, reading them over and over like they might shift if I blinked too quickly. Conditional. Not permanent. Not absolute. My heart began to beat faster. But this time it wasn't fear pressing against my chest. It was something sharper. Something more focused. For the first time since Nathan stood in that living room and claimed the house as his, doubt crept into his victory. Maybe he didn't own it the way he thought. Maybe none of this was final. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling, replaying every conversation Grandma and I had shared over the years. Somewhere in my memory, I knew there had been a name. Someone she trusted. Someone who helped her organize things after my grandfather passed. An attorney. The thought surfaced slowly, like something buried beneath years of routine. Whitaker. Harold Whitaker. I whispered the name under my breath, testing it like it might disappear if I didn't hold on to it tightly enough. Mr. Whitaker had been at our house once years ago, sitting at this very table, reviewing paperwork while Grandma watched carefully over his shoulder. I remembered how she insisted on reading every page before signing, how she asked questions until she understood every word. She had trusted him. And now, suddenly, I needed him. I pushed back my chair and moved toward the hallway closet where old boxes were stacked along the bottom shelf. Dust coated the lids, proof that they hadn't been touched in years. I knelt down and slid the nearest box toward me. Inside were old envelopes, recipe cards, holiday decorations, pieces of life stored away without thought. My fingers moved carefully through the pile. Then I saw it. A small white business card tucked between two folded recipes. Whitaker and Lane Estate Services. My breath caught. I held the card up under the kitchen light, staring at the familiar lettering like it was the first real lifeline I'd been offered since this nightmare began. My hands trembled slightly as I reached for the phone. I dialed the number slowly, pressing each button with deliberate care. The ringing sound stretched longer than expected, each tone pulling tighter against my nerves. 1 ring. 2. 3. Whitaker and Lane. A calm voice answered. How may I assist you? My throat felt dry. Hello, I began carefully. My name is Claire Bennett. I'm calling regarding Eleanor Bennett. There was a pause, a brief silence that carried more weight than words. Please hold, the receptionist said. Soft instrumental music filled the line, but it did nothing to calm the pounding in my chest. I gripped the phone tighter, my mind racing through possibilities. Had I waited too long? Had too much damage already been done? The music stopped. A deeper voice replaced it. Claire, the man said gently. This is Harold Whitaker. Relief washed over me so quickly it almost made me dizzy. Mr. Whitaker, I replied. I need your help. He didn't rush me. He didn't interrupt. He listened as I explained everything, the papers Nathan had presented, the locks that had been changed, the furniture that had disappeared. When I finished, silence lingered on the line. Then he spoke again. Yes, he said slowly. Your grandmother established a family trust several years ago. The words landed like thunder. A trust. I repeated. Yes, he confirmed. The house was placed under trust protection. That means ownership is structured differently than a simple transfer. My breath caught. Nathan had never mentioned that. Not once. Did someone recently assume management authority? Mr. Whitaker asked. Yes, I said quickly. Nathan said Grandma signed papers giving him control. Another pause followed. Longer this time. Then he spoke again, his voice steady but cautious. Management authority under that trust would not be permanent, he explained. It would be conditional. Conditional? The same word I had read only minutes before. What kind of conditions? I asked quietly. Primarily care responsibilities, he replied. The individual managing the property must ensure your grandmother's well-being is maintained. Financial decisions must also follow specific guidelines. A chill ran down my spine. I thought about the missing piano, the missing jewelry box, the late-night trucks. What happens if those conditions aren't followed? I asked. If violations occur, he said carefully, management authority can be reviewed and potentially revoked. Revoked. The word pulsed through my mind like a distant alarm bell finally ringing. Hope stirred again. Fragile, but unmistakable. There's also another concern, he added. I held my breath. Has anyone besides your brother been handling financial matters? Yes. I answered immediately. A woman named Melissa. She says she's a financial advisor. Silence fell again. This time heavier. Was she formally authorized under the trust? He asked. I don't know. I admitted. His tone shifted slightly. That would need to be verified. After we ended the call, I sat quietly for several minutes, letting everything settle into place. A trust existed. Conditions existed. And violations mattered. For the first time, Nathan's control didn't feel absolute. It felt fragile. I walked slowly back into the living room. Melissa stood near the dining table, directing movers who had returned once again. Her voice carried urgency now, sharper than before. Remove everything from the back hallway, she instructed. Another piece of furniture disappeared through the door. I turned toward Nathan. What are you doing now? I asked. Preparing the property, he replied casually. Preparing? That word carried a different meaning now. Preparing for sale. Preparing for removal. Preparing for something bigger than either of us had admitted. Later that evening, my phone rang again. Mr. Whitaker's number appeared on the screen. I answered immediately. I've reviewed the trust amendments, he said. Amendments. Plural. There are multiple versions, he continued. And I found something concerning. My fingers tightened around the phone. What kind of concern? I asked quietly. His voice lowered slightly. There are protections in place that may not favor your brother's actions. Protections. My heart began to race again. After the call ended, I stood in the hallway, staring toward the locked office door. Nathan passed by a few moments later, his expression tight, restless. Melissa leaned toward him and whispered something too quiet to hear. He nodded once, sharply, and for the first time since this began, I saw something new in his eyes. Not confidence, not authority, fear. That was when I realized something important. Nathan hadn't taken control of the house. He had stepped into something much more dangerous than he understood. The piano was the first thing I noticed that morning. Sunlight stretched across the living room floor, landing exactly where it always had. But now there was nothing there to catch it. Just an empty rectangle of dust and faint scratch marks where the legs had once rested. The silence felt louder than usual, like the house itself was holding its breath. For more than 50 years, that piano had stood in the same spot. My grandfather used to play it every Sunday afternoon, his fingers moving carefully over the keys while Grandma hummed beside him. Even after he passed, she refused to let anyone move it. Now it was gone. No warning. No explanation. Just gone. Grandma shuffled slowly into the room behind me, her slippers dragging softly against the floor. Claire, she whispered, her voice fragile. Where is the piano? I turned toward her, my chest tightening. I'm not sure yet, I said gently. Her gaze drifted across the empty space, and her lips trembled slightly. Your grandfather played that every Sunday, she murmured. Her fingers reached out, hovering over the air where the piano had stood, like she expected to feel it there. The look on her face cut deeper than anything Nathan had said so far. This wasn't about money. This was about memory. Nathan walked into the room a few seconds later, his steps confident, casual, like nothing important had happened. "Where is the piano?" I asked him directly. He didn't hesitate. "It was clutter," he replied flatly. "We're simplifying." Simplifying. The word felt sharp and careless. "Clutter," I repeated, disbelief tightening my voice. "That piano has been here longer than you have." He shrugged. "It needed to be moved." "Moved where?" "Storage." He avoided my eyes when he said it. That single movement told me more than his words ever could. Storage didn't require secrecy. Storage didn't happen overnight. Later that afternoon, a knock sounded at the front door. I opened it to find Mrs. Holloway standing there, her expression tight with concern. "Claire," she whispered, stepping closer. "I need to show you something." She handed me a folded piece of paper. I unfolded it slowly. A receipt from an antique dealer downtown. My stomach dropped as my eyes moved across the printed lines. Eatem. Upright piano. Sold. Not stored. Sold. A cold wave of anger spread through my chest, pushing out the helplessness that had filled me for days. "He sold it," I whispered. "Mrs. Holloway nodded grimly. "I saw the truck late last night," she added. "They were loading things before sunrise." Before sunrise. Like thieves avoiding daylight. I thanked her quietly and closed the door, my hands trembling slightly as I held the receipt. That piano wasn't clutter. It was history. And he sold it like it meant nothing. Inside, Melissa stood at the dining table again, flipping through folders with quick, efficient movements. Her calm expression looked thinner now, stretched tight like she was forcing control over something slipping away. "We need to accelerate timelines," she said sharply to Nathan. "Accelerate." The word landed heavy in the air. "Before anyone interferes," Nathan muttered in response. I froze. Before anyone interferes. They knew something was coming. They knew the trust review was approaching. Grandma stepped slowly into the hallway, her blanket wrapped tightly around her shoulders. "Where are my pictures?" she asked suddenly. I followed her gaze. The shelf near the staircase stood half empty. Family photographs, ones that had been there for decades, were gone. Not rearranged. Removed. Her fingers trembled as she reached toward the bare space. "Why are my things disappearing?" she whispered. Fear had replaced confusion in her voice. Real fear. Not the soft uncertainty from before. Something deeper. Something that made my protective instincts flare stronger than ever. I moved beside her and placed my hand gently over hers. "I'll take care of it," I promised quietly, even if I didn't yet know how. That evening, I stepped outside again, needing air that didn't feel heavy with tension. Mrs. Holloway leaned against her porch railing, watching carefully. "I saw them again," she said softly. "Who?" "The truck," she replied. "Different night this time. Same pattern. A pattern." That word changed everything. This wasn't random. It was planned. Systematic. When I returned inside, the house felt colder than before. The movers had left, but their presence lingered like a shadow. I walked through the hallway slowly, scanning every detail, every corner. That was when I noticed it. A folded document on the kitchen counter. A receipt. Another one. I picked it up and read the heading carefully. Antique furniture. Sold. Multiple items listed. The date matched the same night Mrs. Holloway described. My chest tightened. Nathan wasn't reorganizing. He was liquidating, selling pieces of Grandma's life one by one. I took a picture of the receipt with my phone and sent it immediately to Mr. Whitaker. The response came faster than I expected. "That may be a violation." Violation. The word pulsed through my mind like thunder rolling in the distance. Legal consequences weren't just possible anymore. They were approaching. That night, tension inside the house thickened. Nathan's voice grew sharper. Melissa's movements became faster, less controlled. Even the relatives who occasionally visited seemed uneasy now, avoiding eye contact when they passed through the living room. Truth was spreading through the house like cracks in glass. Later, As I walked toward the hallway closet to check supplies, something unusual caught my eye. A cardboard box sat on the floor, one I didn't recognize. I crouched beside it and brushed away a thin layer of dust. The label printed across the side made my breath catch. Original titles. My fingers trembled as I opened the lid. Empty. Completely empty. No papers. No records. Nothing. Someone had removed them. The original documents were gone. That realization settled into my chest like a heavy stone. Without original titles, proof could disappear. Truth could be hidden. I closed the box slowly, my hands shaking. Just then, Nathan's voice drifted in from outside. He stood near the front porch, holding his phone close to his ear. His tone sounded different. Tense. Sharp. "They know," he whispered. A pause followed. Already. My heart pounded harder with every word. Something had reached him. Something outside this house. Something official. He lowered his voice further, turning his back toward the yard. But the damage had already been done. Fear had entered his voice. For the first time since he declared the house his, Nathan didn't sound confident. He sounded cornered. That was when I realized something had changed. Nathan's control wasn't just weakening anymore. It was being watched. The letter arrived just before noon. I saw the mail truck pull away as I stepped onto the porch, its tires crunching slowly over the gravel. The mailbox door hung slightly open, and inside sat a thick envelope with a bright green certified sticker stamped across the front. Whitaker and Lane Estate Services. My fingers felt colder than they should have as I pulled it free. The envelope felt heavier than ordinary mail, like it carried more than paper inside, like it carried consequences. Behind me, the front door creaked open. Nathan stepped outside, squinting into the sunlight. "What's that?" he asked. I turned slowly and held up the envelope without answering. His expression changed the moment he saw the return address. Confidence drained from his face, replaced by something tighter, more guarded. "Give it here," he said. I handed it to him without resistance. He tore the seal open quickly, unfolding the pages with sharp movements. His eyes moved across the lines once, then again, slower this time. The silence stretched longer than usual. "What did you do?" he asked suddenly, his voice sharp. I held his gaze. "I didn't do anything," I replied calmly, but his jaw tightened like he didn't believe me. Inside the house, he walked straight to the kitchen table and dropped the pages flat against the surface. Melissa appeared seconds later, drawn by the sound. "What is it?" she asked. Nathan didn't answer immediately. Instead, he read aloud in a low voice, each word sounding heavier than the last. "Formal notice of trust compliance review." Melissa froze beside him. "Review," she repeated. He nodded stiffly. The paper trembled slightly in his hand. "They're inspecting asset management," he muttered. Inspecting. The word settled into the room like a storm cloud. For the first time, Nathan didn't look like a man in control. He looked like someone calculating how much trouble he was in. Melissa leaned closer to the document, her usual calm expression beginning to crack. "We need to organize everything immediately," she whispered urgently. No polished smile this time. No practiced calm. Just pressure. I watched her closely, noticing how her fingers tapped rapidly against the edge of the table, betraying nervous energy she could no longer hide. Later that afternoon, I stepped outside to clear my head. The air felt heavier than usual, thick with tension that clung to the house like humidity before rain. "Mrs. Holloway waved me over from her yard. "I've got something you need to see," she said quietly. She led me inside her living room, where a small security monitor sat on a corner table. The screen glowed softly in the dim light. She pressed a button and rewound the footage. The image flickered, then stopped. A truck appeared in the frame, late-night timestamp glowing in the corner. My heart began pounding harder as the footage played forward. The truck backed slowly into the driveway. Two figures stepped out, moving quickly toward the house. Blankets wrapped around furniture, boxes carried out one by one. I leaned closer to the screen. "Pause it," I whispered. She did. The truck's side faced the camera now. A license plate partially visible. Clear enough to prove movement. Clear enough to prove intent. They did this after midnight. Mrs. Holloway said softly. I nodded slowly, my chest tightening. This wasn't suspicion anymore. This was evidence. I pulled out my phone and photographed the screen carefully, making sure the timestamp remained visible. Within minutes, I sent the images to Mr. Whitaker. His reply came quickly. This strengthens the case significantly. The words settled into my chest like a steadying hand. Inside the house, tension had begun to fracture what little peace remained. One of our distant cousins stopped by that evening, his expression stiff and uncomfortable. You should stop pushing this, he muttered quietly. Stop pushing what? I asked. He avoided my eyes. Nathan's trying to manage things. Let him manage. That word sounded hollow now. I'm not pushing, I replied calmly. I'm protecting. He shook his head and left without another word. Isolation settled around me again. But this time, it didn't feel as heavy. Later that night, I walked into Grandma's room to check on her. She sat slumped slightly in her chair, her blanket loose around her shoulders. Did you take your medication? I asked gently. She blinked slowly. I forgot, she whispered. My chest tightened. Nathan was supposed to be managing her care. That was one of the conditions Mr. Whitaker had mentioned, and now, already, it was failing. I helped her swallow the pills carefully, watching the way her hands trembled slightly. I feel tired today, she murmured. I know, I said softly. But inside, alarm bells rang louder than ever. This wasn't just about property anymore. This was about her health. Later, voices rose sharply from the kitchen. Nathan slammed a drawer shut so hard the sound echoed through the house. This house is mine, he shouted. The words sounded forced now, like he was trying to convince himself more than anyone else. Melissa stood beside him, speaking quickly under her breath. We need to fix the records, she whispered urgently. Fix. That word felt dangerous. She began gathering papers, stuffing them into her briefcase with hurried movements. For the first time, she didn't bother pretending calm. She left earlier than usual that night, avoiding my eyes as she walked past. Even her confidence was cracking. The phone rang shortly after dinner. I answered immediately. Mr. Whitaker's voice came through, steady and clear. The inspection date has been scheduled, he said. My breath caught. When? I asked. Within the week, he replied. An evaluator will review property records and asset history. Asset history. Everything Nathan had moved. Everything he had sold. Everything he had hidden. All of it would be examined. After the call ended, I stood alone in the hallway, listening to the quiet settle around the house. Nathan paced back and forth near the office door, his movements restless, uneven. He checked the lock once, then again, as if repetition alone could keep secrets safe. The hallway light cast sharp shadows across his face, deepening the tension etched into his expression. He stopped suddenly and glanced toward me. For a split second, I saw it clearly. Fear. Not anger. Not confidence. Fear. Later that night, long after Grandma had fallen asleep, I watched Nathan pass the office door once more. He locked it again. Twice. The sound of the lock clicking echoed through the silent hallway. And as I stood there in the shadows, watching him pace like a man cornered, one truth settled deep into my chest. The house wasn't just being investigated anymore. It was becoming evidence. The morning of the inspection arrived under a gray sky that made the house look smaller than it ever had before. I stood at the front window, watching the driveway, my hands wrapped tightly around a mug of coffee I hadn't touched. The air inside the house felt still, like everything was waiting. Then the first car pulled in. A black sedan rolled slowly to a stop near the curb. The driver's door opened, and Mr. Whitaker stepped out, his posture steady, his expression calm. He carried a leather portfolio under one arm, moving with the quiet confidence of someone used to delivering hard truths. Behind him, another vehicle arrived. Then another. Relatives stepped out slowly, their faces tense, their movements cautious. No one spoke as they entered the house. The living room filled with people, but the silence pressed heavier than noise ever could. Nathan refused to sit. He paced near the fireplace, his footsteps sharp against the hardwood floor. His jaw stayed tight, his shoulders stiff. "This won't change anything," he said suddenly, his voice too loud for the quiet room. No one responded. His words sounded hollow in the stillness. "Mr. Whitaker set his portfolio on the dining table and opened it carefully, removing a clipboard and several folders. His movements were slow and deliberate, like each second mattered. "We'll begin with a property review," he said calmly. He moved through the living room first, his eyes scanning every corner. Then he stopped, right in front of the empty space where the piano had once stood. His pen hovered over the paper. "Missing item," he murmured. He moved to the corner near the window. The antique chair was gone. Another mark on the list. He stepped into the hallway. Empty shelves. Missing photographs. Missing furniture. Each absence told its own story. Each blank space carried weight. Behind me, I heard someone gasp quietly. Nathan's pacing slowed, but he didn't stop. His confidence had shifted into something more fragile. Then Mr. Whitaker returned to the dining table and opened another folder. Inside were printed photographs, still images, security footage. He laid them out carefully across the table, turning each one so the room could see a truck in the driveway, furniture wrapped in blankets, boxes being carried out under the dark sky. Gasps spread through the room. Someone whispered, "That's the piano." Nathan's face drained of color. These removals occurred without authorization. "Mr. Whitaker stated calmly. "No anger. No accusation. Just facts." Melissa stepped forward quickly. "I was assisting with organization," she said, her voice tight. Nothing improper was done. "Mr. Whitaker turned toward her. "May I see your authorization documents?" he asked. She hesitated. Just for a moment, but that moment stretched long enough for everyone to notice. Her fingers trembled slightly as she reached into her briefcase. She pulled out several papers and handed them over. Mr. Whitaker examined them quietly, then looked up. "You were not formally authorized under the trust," he said. The words landed like thunder. Melissa's face tightened. Nathan's breathing grew heavier. The room shifted. Something invisible had cracked. "Mr. Whitaker turned another page and lifted a thick document from his folder. "The trust agreement will now be reviewed," he announced. Silence deepened. He unfolded the pages slowly, the sound of paper echoing through the room. "Management authority granted to Nathan Bennett is conditional," he read aloud. "Dependent upon fulfillment of caregiver and asset preservation responsibilities." My chest tightened as each word settled into place. Caregiver responsibilities. Asset preservation. Nathan's hands clenched at his sides. "If violations occur," Mr. Whitaker continued, "management authority is subject to immediate review." He turned another page, paused. The room leaned into the silence. "There is an additional clause," he said quietly. Nathan stiffened. Melissa stepped backward. Mr. Whitaker adjusted his glasses and continued reading. "In the event that management responsibilities are neglected, authority shall transfer to the individual who demonstrates consistent and documented caregiving support." The words echoed across the room. I felt my breath stop. Transfer. Not to Nathan. Not permanently. To the caregiver. My hands trembled slightly at my sides. He turned another page. "This amendment was added at the request of Eleanor Bennett," he continued, "specifically to ensure the protection of her residents and personal well-being." A murmur spread through the relatives. Someone whispered, "She planned this." Nathan shook his head slowly. "This isn't right," he muttered. "That's not what she told me." Mr. Whitaker remained steady. Your grandmother anticipated the possibility of undue influence, he said. Additional language confirms that sustained caregiving responsibilities take precedence over managerial authority. My eyes burned. But I didn't look away. I didn't move. I didn't speak. Nathan slammed his hand against the table. "This is ridiculous," he shouted. But his voice cracked halfway through the sentence. Not strong. Not confident. Desperate. Mr. Whitaker placed the document flat against the table. "Based on documented violations," he said calmly. "Management authority is hereby revoked." The room fell silent again. Nathan stared at him, stunned. "Revoked?" The word echoed louder than any shout. "Authority will transfer to Claire Bennett." "Mr. Whitaker continued. My breath caught sharply. For a moment, the room felt distant, like I was hearing everything through water. Relatives shifted uneasily. Some stepped back. Others looked down at the floor. Nathan remained frozen. The power in the room had shifted. Not loudly, not dramatically, but completely. He grabbed the edge of the table, his knuckles turning white. "You can't do this," he whispered. But no one answered. No one defended him. Silence had chosen its side. "Mr." Whitaker handed Nathan a formal notice. "Effective immediately," he said. Nathan took the paper slowly, his hands shaking slightly. He read it once, then again. His shoulders dropped, his posture collapsing inward. Across the room, Grandma sat quietly in her chair. She reached out slowly. "Claire," she whispered. I stepped toward her, taking her hand gently in mine. "I knew you would stay," she said softly. Tears burned behind my eyes. Not from fear, not from anger, from something deeper, something steady. As the room emptied and the house grew quiet again, I stood beside her, feeling the weight of everything settle into place. That was when I realized this wasn't just a legal victory. It was something she had planned long before any of us understood. The morning after the decision felt quieter than any morning I could remember. Sunlight slipped gently through the living room windows, touching the empty spaces that still marked what had been taken. The outlines of missing furniture were still there. Pale shapes on the floor that told silent stories of everything that had happened inside these walls. But the silence felt different now. Not tense. Not threatening. Peaceful. I walked slowly across the living room, running my fingers along the back of the couch as I passed. Every step felt steadier than it had in weeks. The house no longer felt like something slipping through my hands. It felt like something waiting to be rebuilt. Nathan was already packing when I entered the kitchen. Cardboard boxes lined the walls, stacked unevenly beside the door. He moved quietly, folding shirts with stiff, mechanical movements. No pacing, no shouting, no sharp commands, just silence. He didn't look up when I walked in. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The tension that once filled the room had drained away, leaving behind something heavier, defeat. Finally, he closed one of the boxes with a strip of tape, pressing it down harder than necessary. "This isn't over," he muttered. His voice sounded smaller than before. Not threatening. Not powerful. Just hollow. I watched him for a moment, then nodded once. Maybe it wasn't over for him. But for me, something had ended. He lifted the box and carried it toward the door. When he passed me, he didn't meet my eyes. He didn't offer another word. And when he stepped outside with the final box, the sound of the front door closing behind him felt softer than I expected. Not dramatic. Not explosive. Just final. Later that afternoon, my phone rang. Mr. Whitaker's name appeared on the screen. I answered immediately. "There's another development," he said. My chest tightened slightly. "It involves Melissa." I listened quietly as he explained that financial irregularities had been discovered in several accounts connected to the trust. Records had been altered. Timelines shifted. Funds redirected without proper authorization. Melissa wasn't just careless. She had crossed legal lines. Her professional license is under review, he continued. The word settled slowly into my mind. Consequences were spreading outward. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just steady. After the call ended, I stepped into Grandma's room. She sat near the window, wrapped in her blanket, sunlight resting gently across her shoulders. The tension that once filled her face had softened. Her breathing looked calmer, steadier. "I feel safer today," she whispered when she saw me. Those 4 words meant more than any legal victory, more than any document. Safety. That had always been the real goal. Days passed slowly after that. Then weeks. The house began to change again, but this time, in the right direction. One afternoon, a delivery truck pulled into the driveway. Not secretive. Not rushed. Official. Documented. 2 men stepped out carefully carrying large, wrapped furniture. My heart pounded as they guided the first piece through the front door. The piano. Grandma's piano. They set it gently back into its place, aligning it with the same faded marks left behind on the floor. The sunlight hit its polished surface just like it used to, warming the wood until it gleamed softly. Grandma walked slowly into the room. Her fingers trembled as she reached out and touched the keys. "I thought I'd never see this again," she whispered. Her voice cracked slightly. But there was relief in it. Not fear. Not grief. Relief. I stood beside her, watching as she pressed a single key. The soft note filled the room, echoing through walls that had held too much silence for too long. One sound. One simple sound. But it brought the house back to life. A few weeks later, I sat across from Mr. Whitaker in his office. Documents spread neatly across his desk. He slid the final page toward me. "This confirms your management authority," he said. I picked up the pen slowly, feeling its weight between my fingers. Signing that page didn't feel like victory. It felt like responsibility. A promise, not to control, but to protect. Later that evening, I returned home as the sun began to set. The golden light spilled through the living room windows, casting warm shadows across familiar furniture. Grandma had already gone to bed. The house rested quietly around me. I sat down on the piano bench, placing my hands gently on the smooth surface. For a long time, I didn't move. I just listened. To the silence, to the steady breathing of the house, to the quiet peace that had taken so long to return. My mind drifted back to the day Nathan stood in this very room and declared the house his. Back then, I had felt powerless, alone, erased. But now, sitting there in the fading light, I understood something I hadn't before. The house never belonged to the loudest voice. It belonged to the one who stayed, the one who cared, the one who refused to walk away when things became difficult. Later that night, Grandma called my name softly from her room. I walked in and sat beside her bed. She reached for my hand, her fingers warm against mine. "I knew you wouldn't leave," she whispered. Tears formed quietly in my eyes. Not from sadness, from gratitude. Trust wasn't written on paper. It wasn't stamped or signed. It was built through patience, through loyalty, through staying when others walked away. Months passed. The garden outside began to bloom again, fresh flowers replacing the weeds that had grown during the chaos. The front yard looked brighter. The house looked stronger. And so did I. Standing in the living room one afternoon, sunlight warming the floor beneath my feet, I realized something that stayed with me long after the noise had faded. Paperwork may claim ownership, but responsibility defines it. If you've ever been treated like you didn't belong, if you've ever stayed loyal while others turned away, then you probably understand what this house really meant to me. I'd truly love to hear your story. Have you ever stood your ground when someone tried to take what mattered most to you? Share your experience in the comments below. Sometimes hearing another person's story reminds us we're not alone in the battles we face. And if stories about family strength, justice, betrayal, and quiet resilience speak to you, stay with us. There are many more stories like this, stories about loyalty, consequences, and the strength it takes to stand your ground when everything feels stacked against you. Make sure you subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Because sometimes, the greatest revenge isn't taking something back. It's proving you were never powerless to begin with.